Hello ladies and gentlemen of the world, welcome back to my channel, but if you're new to my channel then welcome. My name is Zach Jones and I've done a few PowerPoint presentations recently, but now I'm going to do another. This one is about 10 animals of the polar regions, and by that I mean the Arctic and the Antarctic. And I'm going to start with the legend that is the polar bear. Now, the polar bear lives in the northern Arctic, lives in the Arctic Circle. It is the largest land carnivore on the planet. And when I say largest, a fully grown male can stand 10 feet tall, weigh as much as a car, has paws as big as dustbin lids, claws like daggers, and also they have the most powerful bite of any polar bear, of any bear, and certainly strong enough to bite through flesh, blubber, and even bone. But of course, one thing that always intrigues me about the polar bear is that its fur, it's not actually white, it's more like reflective, like it reflects the rays of the sun and the environment around it, so the polar bear can blend in with its background. Of course, I know some of you are probably wondering what they feed on. I mean, their main diet is seals, like ringed and bearded seals, which are very, very difficult to find. But also, polar bears will feed on not just seals, but also birds' eggs to birds, and even walruses and whales that are even bigger than they are. You know, I can't think of a single animal that has the same amount of power as a polar bear. I mean, they can take anything from a bird's egg up to a whale, which is just the most phenomenal amount of power. But of course, what's another thing is that polar bears are actually live either in or around the sea, so they are considered a marine mammal like seals, dolphins and whales. In fact, their Latin scientific name literally means the sea bear. And when the sea ice melts in the summer, the polar bear will often have to swim for miles and miles in the sea in temperatures that would kill a human being in minutes. And one thing that always gets me about the polar bear is that they have a phenomenal sense of smell. In fact, polar bears have actually been observed going in a dead straight line for over 20 miles towards the carcass of a seal or a whale that they wouldn't have seen, but they would have smelled before they could see it. And they probably don't have a much better sense of smell than their close cousins, the brown bears, but in the Arctic, where there's no pollution, very little things that could interfere with their sense of smell, they have the edge. And polar bears' sense of smell is said to be 1,000 times more powerful than ours. Of course, when I said about them hunting prey, I mean, one thing they do is, like, as you can see here, they creep up on seals as they're resting near the ice, and then they just wait for the last moment, and then they leap out of the water and grab a hold of the seal. They either kill it with a single swipe of its paw, or a bite to the head. And only 1 in 10 hunts end in success. But of course, the polar bears, what they mainly feed on first is blubber. It's a thick layer of fat underneath the surface of the skin of a whale or a seal that keeps them insulated. And you might think that's very unhealthy for them, but actually blubber has an enormous amount of calories in it. In fact, a seal like this could probably only be quite small, but its blubber alone would contain over 100,000 calories, enough to sustain a polar bear for more than a week. And another method they have of hunting, especially with things like seals, is quite often seals will be hiding in in a layer underground, and it can be very thick snow and ice that sets as hard as concrete. But the polar bear can just stand up on its hind legs and punch clean through ice and snow to catch the seals unaware. And of course, when I said about that they can take on whales, and when I say, I mean, they mainly prey on things like beluga whales, and one thing they do is they tend to hang around where the breathing holes, which both seals and whales need so they can come back up to the surface to breathe, and then the polar bear will strike. And it's actually said a fully grown male polar bear can actually pull out a juvenile whale that's more than 5 times its body weight. And of course, the most dangerous prey they hunt is walrus. And walrus are the largest seals in the Arctic, and they are probably the most dangerous animal polar bears will regularly hunt. I mean, they weigh over a ton. They have thick hide that's as strong as chainmail. But also, they have tusks that are about as long as my leg, and it's very rare that polar bears will go for a walrus. I mean, the only time they go for them is if they're really, really hungry. And quite often, the walrus will, as his bulky body and enormous tusks, will keep the polar bear at bay because they could risk a very serious injury. Of course, but also another thing about polar bears is they have been known to deliberately hunt humans, and especially in somewhere like Svalbard in the Arctic, which is an archipelago, a whole group of islands. The polar bears in that part of the world will have never seen a human being before. And polar bears are one of the very few animals on the planet that will deliberately target, hunt and kill a human. I mean, it's desperately rare, but you've always got to have that in the back of your mind. And while they may look cute and cuddly, if you try to cuddle one, it would be a very bad idea, because, as I explained earlier, they are confirmed man-eaters, but that's all down to the fact that life is tough in the Arctic, food is scarce, and anything that moves is a potential meal, and that includes me. But also, another thing about polar bears is that a lot of the year they're solitary, but of course a male and a female polar bear will only come together briefly to mate, and then the male leaves and the female will dig out a den in somewhere like a mountain slope, and she will have possibly 2 or 3 cubs in the winter, because during the winter time in the polar regions, the sun doesn't rise for like 5 months, and so she stays in the den for the whole winter, looking after her cubs. And of course, I also mentioned about the bite force of a polar bear. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's only recently just been recorded, and it has, and I think it's just over 1,000 pounds. So definitely the strongest bite of any bear, and certainly powerful enough to bite through flesh, blubber and bone. But also, polar bears, especially the males, can be quite territorial, so they can be very, very aggressive when they're either defending their patch or fighting over breeding rights, or quite often when they're all fighting over a carcass of something like a seal or a whale. But unfortunately, even though they are the kings of the Arctic, polar bears have been classed as endangered and, well, vulnerable and close to endangered. And the main reason for that is climate change, because of our human activities, like with fumes from factories, but also fumes from petrol cars, pouring everything like that into the atmosphere. It's causing global temperatures to rise, and that's melting the sea ice that they depend on, and it means that when the sea ice begins melting earlier in the year, polar bears have to use more energy when they hunt, so it's draining them of their reserves, and on average at that time of year they only succeed once in 20 hunts. And if this carries on, then polar bears are just going to either disappear, or they're going to be forced to come into closer contact with humans, and that can lead to polar bears attacking because they get really, really hungry, and of course, to them, a human being is an easy meal. But if we do want to protect the kings of the ice from disappearing forever, then one thing we need to do is be a little more responsible with what we do for the natural world, like stop using things that are fossil fuels, because that's just damaging the atmosphere. But also, another thing is work with conservationists that are working to protect polar bears, but also there's another thing that I haven't mentioned about the polar bear is that there's actually a coastline in northern Canada in America where polar bears have actually been seen where they've learned to adapt because they are fairly close to people, they don't really pay any attention to them because they spend more time focusing on what really brings the polar bears there, and that is one of their favourite foods, beluga whales. And because fortunately polar bears aren't endangered, but they are considered a vulnerable species, and they are monitored to make sure that they're not completely at threat. I mean, the only time that polar bears are of any danger to humans is if they're frightened, cornered, protecting cubs, or more often if they're just incredibly hungry. But I mean, attacks on people are rare, but you've always got to have that in the back of your mind, and just remember that you don't go to polar bears alone, because if you are alone around a polar bear and without things like bear bangers or flares to drive them away, then it will be the last thing you ever do. Of course, this is their range in the Arctic Circle. Now, the next animal I'm going to show you is one of the most brutal predators of Antarctica. It's an animal that will literally thrash a penguin out of its own skin. The terrifying leopard seal. Leopard seals are one of the top predators of Antarctica, and they are probably the most fearsome hunters of all seals, mainly feeding on warm-blooded prey. And a fully grown female leopard seal can grow 3 meters long, weigh half a ton, have canine teeth as long as my finger, and could make an easy meal of a penguin, which is one of their favourite foods. And when I say about the leopard seal being a ferocious hunter, I mean, I'm not even joking about that. I mean, they've been observed by scientists in Antarctica because they prey mainly on other seals, but also penguins, and they do occasionally take fish and krill, which are a shrimp-like crustacean. But of course, how they hunt, I mean, one of the main things that leopard seals do when they hunt is they tend to hide out in a small stretch of water just between the open sea and the shallows or the shoreline, because that is when they can get to a penguin easily, because penguins always have to go out to sea to feed, and of course when they are going out to sea they just have to run the gauntlet as fast as they can from the shore right to the open